All right, so to pick off where we last were, we introduced this idea of hotspot policing and how we want to deploy and allocate officers right at noted times for specific crimes and things like that. So something that we should keep in mind about this policy, right, is that we have this flexibility to prioritize certain crime outcomes. And what it also does, right, is that in theory, right, is that if we, allocate officers to, certain areas, right, this becomes more efficient. It's a more efficient use of police resources in the sense of instead of just being used randomly, it's being targeted, right? So if we have like a targeted deterrent effect where we're deploying officers before they even happen and we're sort of making predictions about where crime is going to happen before it does, then because of that, we are saving the time and money and effort that goes with arresting someone. We could also, we could even say we're jailing them and feeding them. We're also, because we're having possibly, fewer police contacts, we're lowering civil rights abuses. That's actually an interesting research question. I have to think about that for a second. Is that if we are lowering police contacts, then, we are, by preventing crime to begin with, then we are actually preventing, like, potential civil rights abuses, in theory anyway. Right? So that's how it's supposed to work. Now, in the early days, and for much of the research that ended up happening, right, is that you would have some officer, and if they went to the hotspot in question, we're going to put it green, even though that doesn't make sense, and we put them in red. Initially, a lot of the early research was not concerned about what officers did in these specific spots, right? So what they initially did a lot, and in fact, in most of the research, right, we would have officers deployed, and they would do kind of what they wanted, right? Maybe that's reading the paper, maybe that's doing a crossword, maybe that is talking to people or something like that. But there was a lot of freedom as to what was happening, because the chief idea and understanding was whether or not if we like just send people to focus out here, does this work or not, right? So in that case, then what do we end up finding, right? What do we get from this? In general, we do have expectations, right, that, we can expect depending on your definition, I think the research body suggests that there's about a 20% reduction in general for crime, right? So if we are targeting specific crimes at certain dates and time, we can expect a 20% decline to happen, right? And, depending on, your perspective on this, maybe that's substantial, maybe it's not, right? And there's a lot of things and factors that can go in that kind of decision. We'll unpack those, some of those in a bit. So a different question is, though, is that if we send officers here, right, to this particular hotspot, do we just leave them there? No, that doesn't make any sense, right? Officers have to be mobile. If we're just camped out all day, then what do they end up doing? Then they're essentially like video cameras, right? Or, they are, maybe just like a turret in a tower or something like that. And maybe that's good, and maybe there is a time and place for turrets and towers and things like that, but that's not really good because, maybe crime just moves around the corner, right? If we send them out there, if we have patterns that are known to, offenders, and the pattern is, repetitive, maybe it's not so good after all. So in this case, then, excuse me, in this case, then, what we end up finding or suggesting is that the key point is that if we deploy, an officer or officers for about 15 minutes to a single spot, then this is going to yield the crime benefit, so the crime positive effect, right? Not increasing more crime, but just like the positive effect that's coming out of this. So that's, again, depending on your perspective, that is, maybe pretty good. That's something that we want, and we have, a strategy where, we are actually using officers and like using them in this sense is useful, right? There is a known benefit to having officers, to having patrol, and having them impact society in some way. But is that true, right? And is that actually, tenable for many police departments? And what kind of benefits do we realize, from, like this kind of study? So we're going to label this first section important notes about hotspots policing research in general. And with these important notes, these are also important research questions to consider in the future. And then this could be something that you bring up, in your profession, in your job. This could also be something that you use to write a thesis, or maybe it's a component that you end up maybe wanting to use for a comprehensive exam. Whatever. The sky is the limit. So the first thing that we should be aware of, right, is that, when we read through a lot of these papers, right, these are funded by grant money. So, the federal government is like, we're looking for new innovations in police studies. We want people to chase this money, and to see if it works, we're willing to pay you, right? And more often than not, what will end up happening, right, is that officers are compensated with an extra shift. And so, because, a police department is beholden to, the rest of their job, right? So, they have calls for service, they have, they have other crimes they have to attend to, they have other duties out there, so they can't necessarily do this new project randomly, right? So what will end up happening is that officers are compensated, via overtime pay, like if you sign up for an extra shift or something like that, or, if you, like, the similar thing is like when an officer signs up to be like the construction cop car, like if there's construction happening, so they just sit in their car doing, nothing other than being there, then, like this is a sim kind of thing, right? So officers just like pick up an extra shift, right? And that's paid for this grant money. What this means, though, is that, this is in a very controlled environment. And officers are just like, kind of like, great, we're getting this extra pay. But this, the thing is like, can this continue? In the long term, right? Is this something, that can happen once the grant money goes away? Some agencies will be like, yeah, well, they're willing to invest in it. They're able to secure funding to do this. They're able to convince their city government to let them do that. Others, maybe not so much, right? Because there's this paper, I think it was by Hoover and colleagues in 2017, it's in Justice Quarterly, that was basically like, hey, even though we may have this really great idea that reduces crime, it costs, a bunch of money to make this happen, right? And we really have to ask questions about, from a public policy standpoint, is it worth the amount of money we have to pay to see this benefit, right? Is it worth it? If it's not, then why are we doing it, right? Especially if it comes at the cost of other aspects of the police department. So there's a room for debate about, if we have a 20% reduction or more or less, is this, worth the extra time, money, and effort that goes into it? And that's something that's going to be happening at the local level. That's a contextual debate that needs to happen, but that we can't answer immediately. But it is something worth discussing, is like how much crime has to be prevented for this to be worth it from a financial standpoint, right? Especially if, the investment, cuts out other important services, right? Because there has to be some give and take, because there's not like an endless pool of cash and money, that goes in. So that's something to hold on to for now. So the second point, actually comes with the definition of a hotspot itself. So when you think about a hotspot, right, it's easy to think of it like a location, that attracts crime, has crimes attractors, whatever you want to do it. Maybe this is a particular bar, maybe it's a certain address, maybe it's a block on a street block or something like that, or a neighborhood per se. All of that is really contingent. What ends up happening though is that when you have different definitions, then like what is a true hotspot, right? So it becomes something that we really don't understand over time, right? At the same time, like what makes a cool spot, relative to something else, right? Is it, if we are focusing on hotspots, right, crimes like that, how do we know that whenever we identify one, this isn't a regression to the mean issue where we see, maybe spikes in crime that, inflate the count, and now we're investing resources instead of in areas that don't actually need it, all because we saw a high point for a little bit, right? So that's something to consider then, is like, what on earth do we do with this, right? And like, how do we define this, right? It's like the same thing if you think about, from a neighborhood, right? Like, what on earth is neighborhood, and how do you know, like, what are the edges and bounds of it? I used to live in Riverside, and they would, like, even though there were different neighborhoods, right? You'd be like, you're in Rubidoux, now you're in downtown, now you're in University, Canyon Crest, right? Like, signs would be put up, but it'd be like, wait, how do I know like this is that neighborhood, and how do they end up defining it? It's really kind of bizarre how they end up doing that, right? Even though people know it, but people don't really know it, so it's really kind of confusing then. So with respect to any kind of hotspot then, there is a severe definitional issue, and because of that definitional issue, this does affect police allocation, because if we aren't sitting in the right areas or the right spots for the right amount of time, then is it really working, right? And how do we make sure we have effective use of resources in those areas if we just can't ever figure it out? So that is something to also ponder. Another thing to consider as well is, what do police do at these spots? Does it matter? For the most part, right, officers tend to be concentrated in certain spots, and they are kind of given free rein, but it's possible if they, take a more active role in something. So maybe that is engaging with the community, maybe it's building some sort of community trust, maybe, or maybe they don't do any of that. And they just keep doing what they're doing. Like, what kind of benefits do we see? And are they substantial enough to encourage a change in how officers are directed, right? Or does that encourage and advocate for a new kind of change and approach within that community? Again, that's something that's going to be highly contextual. It's going to change based off of the historic relationship between the officers in certain areas. But, maybe that's something to consider, because if we just allow them to do random behavior, but the premise of this project, or this, police strategy, is to take more deliberate action into it, then perhaps we should do something more deliberate than not just like doing it randomly, right? There is a growing body of research on this topic, something that would be great for a research critique, but, something to explore more, but that is an important area to consider. And I guess we'll leave this for the last kind of like major key point. There are many points that we could talk to and discuss, but we'll leave it for this, right? So hotspots then, allocate officers to certain areas over time, right? And this gets into certain neighborhoods as to like what is a bad neighborhood, what's a good neighborhood. And depending on what those areas are, there could very much be a history or relationship, with police that may or may not be very positive. So what do I mean by that, right? So if you're in an area, right, that is considered high crime, and or at least according to this, and you have officers who maybe showed up already a lot before, but now they're showing up more often and randomly, and maybe they are investigating or being more aggressive with their approach with people. They're stopping and frisking people, who knows, depending on what the strategy is and so on. What you end up doing is that you're using a data assumption that may very well, have consequences in terms of racial profiling. It may have consequences for, a disproportionate use of force against people of color. Possibly, it could possibly, have issues of reinforcing, a lack of police legitimacy. It could have issues related to whether or not people view the police as being compliant, and possibly lead to more aggressive interactions with officers. The point being is that in certain areas where officers are more allocated, you could have an over policing effect, or at least the perception of it, which ends up damaging relationships, damaging public view of a police department, and could possibly be negative, right? And that's something that has to be countered then, is that if we're going to develop this new strategy that may be effective in terms of getting crime numbers, there's also the consideration of like how does this affect a greater system, right? And like, does this affect, is it actually a net negative based on some other factor that may or may not be observed, right? So a lot of the existing hotspots research does not consider this question, or if they do, it's not necessarily a throwaway, but it wasn't the chief point of the research study, so it doesn't receive the attention that it probably does. Again, that's something that it would be worthy of discussion or in a research critique. I think we'll kind of leave that, for now, because I think there's enough here that you guys can kind of develop and explore on your own. But I think hopefully this gives a nice general overview of what we're talking about here today. So with that, we'll end this section, and I'll see you guys in the next